Holly Quinn still had the smell of burnt coffee and industrial dish soap on her hands when she sat down at table 11, a guest's table, not one of hers. Her apron was still tied. She'd forgotten to take it off, and she couldn't afford the $11 it would have cost to have the other one laundered, so she'd stopped noticing. 27 years old, $41,000 in medical debt, with her mother's name on it, and a pair of work shoes she'd glued back together twice. She'd finished her morning shift 20 minutes ago. She was supposed to be on a bus by now. Instead, her best friend Delia had cornered her by the service station, arms crossed, refusing to take no for a third time. 6 o'clock, table 11, his name's Brennan. No last name, no photo, no Googling, that's his condition, not mine. Holly had asked why a man would put conditions on a blind date. Delia hadn't had an answer, and Holly hadn't pushed, because in Providence a shift was a shift, and everything else stayed simple. That was the rule she'd built her whole life around. So she sat there in a borrowed chair in her own workplace, still in uniform, hands folded so nobody could see the calluses, doing the thing she did best, waiting, and taking up as little room as possible while she did it. At 6:10, the door opened. A man walked in, dark suit, no tie, no hurry, and beside him, walking without a leash, was a black Neapolitan Mastiff the size of an armchair. The dining room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when everybody decides at once not to look. A woman near the window set down her fork. The manager, a man who'd once fired a busser for dropping a spoon, didn't say a word about the dog. He just nodded and stepped back. The stranger didn't scan the room for his table. He didn't check his phone, didn't ask the hostess, didn't hesitate for even half a second. He crossed the floor like he already knew exactly where he was going, and he sat down precisely opposite Holly Quinn. And the dog lay down under the table with the long sigh of an animal that had done this 100 times before. For one full second, neither of them reached for a menu, a chair, a word. Holly's hands went cold around her water glass. She'd never seen this man before in her life. She didn't know his face. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he did for a living. And something in the way the room had gone silent told her she probably didn't want to. But she knew the dog. She knew the dog. And she couldn't tell a single person in that room how. If you're enjoying this so far, hit that like button, it genuinely helps more than you'd think. Share it with someone who loves a story with a twist they won't see coming. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we tell one of these every single week. Now let's go back to that dining room, to a waitress in an apron sitting at a table she isn't allowed to sit at, and find out what happens when the man across from her finally opens his mouth. The man was the one who broke the silence, and he did it by saying nothing at all about the dog. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain why an animal that weighed as much as 2 grown adults was allowed to lie beneath a table in a restaurant with a 3-week waiting list. He simply pulled his chair a little closer, placed both hands on the white tablecloth, and said, "You're early." His voice wasn't loud. That was the first thing Holly noticed. People usually spoke loudly in rooms like this because they wanted the room to hear them. He spoke only loudly enough for one person. "My shift ended at 5:40, she said, then immediately wished she hadn't. It was the answer of an employee, not a woman on a date. He didn't react. He didn't raise an eyebrow, offer a sympathetic smile, or give her the polite nod people reserved for those who served them. His eyes rested for half a second on her apron, on the knot at her hip that she had forgotten to untie, then moved away. He said nothing about it. She had prepared 3 jokes to soften the blow in case he mentioned it. None of them were used, and somehow that unsettled her even more. The waiter arrived. It wasn't Delia. It was a new boy Holly had taught how to fold napkins into fans the month before, and he looked straight through her as though she were a smudge on the glass. The man said, "The sea base for her." No sauce and water, no ice. The waiter had already written 3 words before Holly could open her mouth. Then the man stopped. He looked down at his own hand for a second, and Holly saw something pass over his face, so quickly that she would missed it if she had blinked. "I'm sorry," he said. "Bad habit. What would you like?" The waiter stood frozen with his pen in hand. No one had ever told him what to do in a situation like this. Holly looked at the menu she had memorized 3 years earlier, knew so well that she knew which dishes lost money and which ones the chef hated making, and said, "The sea base is fine." He didn't argue. He didn't ask, "Are you sure?" in the way people did when they wanted to appear kind. He simply nodded to the waiter, and the boy disappeared faster than Holly had ever seen anyone leave a table. "You know this place," he said. It wasn't a question. I know a lot of places. You know this place, he repeated in the same voice, without adding a trace of emphasis, and for the first time that evening, Holly felt something cold travel down the back of her neck. Not because he had figured it out, because he didn't ask anything more. He left it there on the table between them, like something he could pick up whenever he wanted and was choosing not to touch. She clasped her hands more tightly. Delia told me your name is Brennan. That's right, that's all? For today, that's all. He turned his water glass a quarter turn without drinking. You can ask. I just don't promise I'll answer. Then I won't ask. This time, he smiled, and it was so slight it almost didn't exist, but it was real. You're the first person in years to say that, and sound as though you mean it. Across the room, the manager stood beside the host station, with both hands clasped behind his back, looking toward table 11 before immediately turning his eyes elsewhere. He had been standing there for 10 minutes. Holly knew him 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 3 straight years, and she had never once seen him unsure of where he belonged. The man across from her never looked in his direction. He didn't need to. That was what sent the second chill through Holly's spine. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't raised his voice, threatened anyone, or snapped his fingers. He had simply sat down, and an entire roomful of people had rearranged itself around him like water flowing around a stone. You work here, he said. Again, it wasn't a question. Nothing was a question with this man. Morning shift, Delia didn't tell me. Delia didn't tell you a lot of things. No, he agreed. She didn't. He reached for his water glass, then stopped halfway. Because the dog was getting up. Holly felt it before she saw it, the enormous slow movement beneath the table making the cloth tremble. And then a warm, heavy mass, firm as a sandbag, pressed against her knees, and the black mastiff pushed its head into her lap, released one long breath, and went completely still. Holly's hand was already resting on its head, before her mind had time to wonder whether it should be. Her fingers found the hollow behind its ear, the exact place, without searching. She heard the water glass touch the tablecloth across from her. She looked up. The man hadn't moved. Not a single muscle in his face shifted, but all the color had drained from him. It doesn't do that, he said. His voice was so flat it sounded like a man reading numbers. It's never done that. 4 hours earlier, at 11:40 in the morning, Holly Quinn was standing in the blind corner between the bar and the kitchen door, doing the things she did every day without anyone ever knowing. She counted. Table 2, 4 people, $214 before tax. They would leave 18%, because the woman in the green sweater had said thank you twice, and people who said thank you twice always left 18%. Table 5, 2 people, $130, 15%, maybe 12 if the man paying was the one who had ordered first. Table 9 would leave nothing at all. Table 9 had never left anything in 3 years. She added it up in her head, subtracted the share for the bar and the busser, and arrived at a number. Today's number was 84. She needed 110. She had needed 110 every day for 37 months, and she had never stopped counting, not while she smiled, not while she poured water. At table 7, there was a coffee stain the size of a coin on the napkin. Replacing it meant $1.20 deducted from the shift. Holly folded it diagonally, twice, set it down with the clean side facing up, and the stain vanished inside the fold as though it had never been there. It was a skill no one had taught her. She had taught herself during her second month, when she realized that $1.20 multiplied by 4 times a shift, multiplied by 6 days, came to $30 a week. And $30 a week was $120 a month, and $120 was nearly 10% of the monthly co-payment she had to scrape together to keep a bed in Warwick for a woman who didn't always remember her name, while the rest of the massive $4,100 monthly bill continued to pile up as debt. At table 4, a man snapped his fingers. He didn't turn his head. He didn't look up. He simply snapped twice into the air as though calling an animal, and Holly came, and Holly smiled, and Holly asked what he needed, and he said more lemon without speaking to anyone at all. She brought the lemon. She was still smiling. She had learned long ago that a smile wasn't something she gave away. It was something she put on, like an apron, and both came off at the end of the shift. In her apron pocket beneath her order pad and 2 pens, there was a leather strap. It was old, frayed at one end, hand-stitched with thread that didn't match, shorter than any dog leash sold in a store. It had been in that pocket during every shift for 2 years. She never took it out. She only touched it sometimes with 2 fingers when someone at a table spoke to her as though she weren't there. Then she took her hand away and kept working. At 12:10, Delia Ward blocked her at the service counter with her arms folded across her chest, and the look Holly had known since the 10th grade. They had known each other for 11 years. Holly knew Delia's laugh, the laugh that began with something like a sneeze and ended with her having to grab hold of something. Holly knew Delia brought donuts from Allie's for the morning shift every Tuesday, not because it was anyone's birthday, but simply because Tuesday was the longest day. Holly knew Delia talked with both hands when she was trying to persuade someone, and right now, both of those hands were moving. 6 o'clock, Delia said. You don't have an evening shift. You don't have plans. Don't tell me you have plans. I have a bus at 6:15. You've had a bus at 6:15 every day of your life. Holly was about to refuse for the 3rd time. She had already arranged the words, gentle and funny, the kind of refusal that left no mark. Then Delia lowered her hands, and that was what made Holly stop, because Delia never lowered her hands in the middle of an argument. Holly, Delia said, you haven't let anyone buy you a meal in 3 years. No one said anything more. Plates clattered in the kitchen. Holly looked down at her hands, at the calluses along the base of her fingers, at the skin thickened by carrying trays, and she thought about $110, and she thought about the $11 she would lose if she had to wash her second uniform, and she said yes. Delia hugged her too tightly, then disappeared into the event room before Holly could change her mind. There was one thing Delia didn't know after 11 years. She didn't know why Holly always refused Friday evening shifts. Delia thought it was because of the bus, or because of her mother, or because of one of the dozens of reasons Holly had given her and Delia had never counted. But it wasn't. Holly refused Friday nights because Friday night was when the black car parked outside Ardith House, and she had spent 2 years arranging her entire life around, never having to step out of the kitchen at that hour. She didn't know the name of the person sitting inside the car. She only knew another name, a name she had read on the screen of a scanner in the darkness, and that name was Rory. 9 days before that evening, Matthew Brennan Falco sat in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building he owned, listening as his attorney told him that the greatest problem in his life wasn't the evidence. The attorney's name was Pryor. His hair was silver. He had practiced law for 40 years, and he had a habit of delivering unpleasant truths in the voice of a man reading the weather forecast. Merritt Lowe has spent 4 years on you, Pryor said. She isn't stupid, she isn't greedy, and she isn't in a hurry. Those are the 3 worst qualities a federal prosecutor can have. Matthew said nothing. He had read the file. He knew what Lowe had, and he knew what she didn't have, and the distance between those 2 things was wide enough to let him sleep at night, if he still slept. But that isn't what worries me, Pryor said. What worries me is that if this goes to trial, 12 citizens of Rhode Island will sit inside a wooden box and look at you for 6 weeks. And what will they see? A 37-year-old man, $90 million, no wife, no children, living alone in a building no one has ever entered. Not one person who can take the stand and say they've had dinner in your home. Pryor closed the file. You don't need a better story, Matthew. You need a life that looks like a life. Juries don't convict on evidence. They convict on feeling, and right now, the feeling people get from you is a locked safe. Matthew looked through the window at the river and the low rooftops of Federal Hill, and he didn't answer. 3 days later, Tobias Keene told him the same thing in different words. Toby was 62 years old and had sat at Matthew's father's right hand since before Matthew had learned to walk, and he spoke like a man who had never needed to raise his voice in order to be heard. They were in the kitchen of Toby's house in Barrington one morning while he poured coffee. Pryor is right, Toby said, but he's saying it the wrong way. This isn't about putting on a performance for a jury. This is about people needing to see you living like an ordinary human being, and it needs to begin today, not on the day you're indicted, because anything that starts after an indictment looks like an act. He set a cup of coffee in front of Matthew. Have dinner somewhere, in public, not at an event, not at a fundraiser. 1 table, 1 woman. Someone who doesn't know who you are and has no reason to pretend. Matthew said he didn't have time for that. Toby said he knew. Then he continued in the same quiet voice, Ardith House. Friday. You've been going there for 2 years. No one will think it's strange when you appear, and that's exactly what matters. A man who changes his habits gets noticed. A man who keeps his habits and adds one chair doesn't. He even knew someone who could arrange it. An event manager who worked there, the younger sister of a man he had once done business with. The kind of person who talked too much and never said anything important. Matthew remembered thinking that Toby had never given bad advice in his life, and that was why he was still alive at 62, in a profession where most people didn't live to see 40. He agreed. He agreed because Pryor was right and Toby was right, and because he was tired of being right alone. But neither of those reasons was the real one. The real reason was an afternoon 11 days earlier, at an animal clinic open 24 hours a day on the east side of the city, when a woman in blue scrubs looked at the dog's weight chart and told him it had lost 24 pounds in 2 years. And there was nothing in its blood work that could explain why. She had run every test. She had run them again. Then she closed the chart and said the words Matthew had carried with him every day since. "He isn't sick, Mr. Brennan. He's waiting." Dogs don't understand the idea of someone not coming back. They only understand not yet. And he's been living inside that not yet for 2 years. Matthew had asked her what he was supposed to do. She said there was nothing he could do. She said sometimes they stopped on their own, and sometimes they didn't. From that day forward, Matthew took the dog everywhere he went. Into conference rooms, into the car, into rooms where no one dared ask why a 154-pound animal was lying beneath the table. He didn't do it because he believed it would help. He did it because every time he walked out the door without the dog, he pictured it lying on the marble floor in the hallway, its face turned toward the entrance, waiting, and he couldn't bear the thought that there was a living creature in that building waiting for someone who would never walk through that door again. So when Toby said dinner, Matthew thought of a table and chairs and a long evening spent sitting still in one place. He didn't think about the woman at all. He only thought that the dog would be allowed to come with him. The dog didn't lift its head from her lap for the rest of dinner, and neither of them mentioned it again. Matthew stayed seated. He drank his water. He asked her about her work with questions broad enough that she could answer with anything she chose, and Holly realized it was a skill, one a person learned only after spending many years in rooms where asking the wrong question could be costly. She gave him half answers. She said she had worked there for 3 years. She didn't say why. He said he worked in real estate. She didn't ask what kind. They sat inside the space between those two half-truths, like two people standing at opposite ends of a bridge, neither willing to take the first step. Her hand remained on the dog's head. She didn't realize what she was doing until she had already done it. Her fingers had slipped beneath its jaw, searching for the pulse, counting. 78. A little fast for an animal lying still. Then she counted its breathing, 16 breaths a minute, steady, without any wheezing, and she noticed that when she lifted the skin along its spine, it returned to place a little too slowly, the kind of delay seen in an animal that wasn't drinking enough water, and she thought it needed about 17 more fluid ounces a day before she stopped herself. She pulled her hand away. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She hadn't done that with any living creature in 3 years. She hadn't allowed herself to. Matthew was watching her. He said nothing, but he had seen it. She knew he had seen it, and the frightening part wasn't that he had noticed. It was that he chose not to ask. He stored it somewhere. She had the feeling this man stored everything somewhere, and never threw anything away. "Are you tired?" he asked. It was the first real question he had asked all evening. "I'm always tired. Then I won't keep you long." But he didn't ask for the check. He stayed another 15 minutes and asked her about Providence, about how the city had changed, about the new bridge, and she answered. And there came a moment when she heard herself laugh, only a brief sound, and it startled her. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed inside this building, when she wasn't serving someone. When the check arrived, it came on a black leather tray, and the waiter placed it in the center of the table with the caution of a man setting down something that might explode. Holly reached for it. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was instinct after 3 years of watching other people pay. Matthew's hand settled on the tray half a second before hers. Then he did something she would think about for weeks afterward, though in that moment it passed so quickly it almost seemed not to have happened. He didn't take out a card. A man in that suit, at that table, inside a restaurant where the manager didn't dare look in his direction, and he didn't take out a card. He opened his wallet, counted out a stack of cash with 2 fingers, placed it on the tray, folded the cover shut, and pushed it toward the edge of the table. The waiter carried it away without returning any change, and no one said a word about it. "Do you always pay in cash?" Holly asked. He looked at her for a second longer than necessary. "I find it simpler." Simpler for whom? He didn't answer. He only smiled, that small smile that almost didn't exist, and Holly had the unmistakable feeling that she had just asked the right question, and that was precisely why she wouldn't be given the answer. The dog rose when he did. It didn't need to be told. It simply moved from one place to another like a shadow weighing 154 pounds, and the entire dining room once again did what it had done at 6:10, falling silent and looking away. Outside, the air that month was cold and carried the smell of water from the bay. The black car was parked directly in front of the entrance. No one was allowed to park directly in front of Ardith House. "Give me your number," Matthew said. It wasn't a question, but then he stopped and corrected himself, just as he had corrected the C-base order. And this time Holly realized he was trying, and that trying made him uncomfortable. "I'm sorry. Would you like to give me your number?" She should have said no. She had 10 reasons, and every one of them was true. She thought about the bus, about the $11 for laundry, about the $110 a day, about a woman in Warwick who didn't always remember her name. Then she recited her phone number 1 digit at a time to a man whose last name was the only thing she knew, and she didn't understand why she did it, and she wouldn't understand for many days. He didn't save it in his phone. He merely nodded once, then opened the car door, and the dog climbed inside, and before the door closed, it turned its head and looked back at her through the glass, and Holly stood on the sidewalk in her uniform until the taillights disappeared around the corner of Atwells Street. The number 68 bus dropped her off 3 blocks from home at 9:20, and she walked the rest of the way through the cold without fastening her coat because she didn't realize she was cold. Her apartment was on the 4th floor above a laundromat that stayed open until 11 o'clock at night, and the staircase had 19 steps, which she had counted often enough to climb them in the dark. Inside, she didn't turn on the ceiling light. She switched on the small table lamp. From beneath the floor came the sound of a dryer turning, that steady tumbling noise with a soft knock on every revolution, a zipper or a coin someone had forgotten in a pocket, and Holly had lived with that sound for so long that silence was what kept her awake. Her phone vibrated. Delia. "How did it go?" 3 question marks. Then 3 more messages came one after another. "Holly, and are you alive? And did he really bring a dog? I heard he brought a dog." Holly watched the screen glow and then go dark in the dim room. She didn't answer. She took off her apron at last, after 9 hours, and hung it on the hook behind the door as she did every evening. And she stood there with one hand still resting on the fabric for longer than necessary. Then she sat down at the table and opened her laptop. It was old, its fan rattled, and it took 40 seconds to wake. The cursor blinked inside the search bar. She didn't type Brennan. She had possessed that name all evening. It had rested on the table between them for 3 hours, and she didn't want it. A name would only tell her about the man, and the man wasn't what had made her hands turn cold in the restaurant. She typed Neapolitan Mastiff Providence. She pressed enter. She wasn't looking for information. She was looking for an answer to a question she had been asking herself since 6:11 that evening, and that question had only 2 possible answers, and she only needed to know whether she was right or wrong. The first result wasn't a page about the breed. It wasn't a club or a kennel. It was an obituary page, the Providence Journal. Holly sat perfectly still. The dryer below struck once, then again. She clicked. The page loaded slowly from top to bottom, the words first and the photograph afterward, and she read the words before she saw the picture. Rory Falco, 41, a native of Providence, had passed away. The date beneath it was from 2 years earlier, in March. The obituary was brief. It was brief in the way obituaries from certain families were always brief, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing was permitted to be said. No cause, no flowers. He was survived by an uncle and a younger brother whose name was omitted from the text, though Holly now knew exactly whose ghost she was looking at. Then the photograph finished loading. It had been taken outdoors in the afternoon light, perhaps in someone's backyard. A man was laughing. He wasn't laughing at the camera. He was laughing at something outside the frame, the kind of laugh that belonged to someone caught in the middle of a joke. He wore a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his left hand rested on the head of a dog, a black dog, as large as an armchair. It stared directly into the lens with the sorrowful, folded eyes of a creature that had grown tired of photographs long ago. There was a small hollow behind its left ear, a place the man's hand didn't reach, and Holly knew exactly where it was. She knew it with the tips of her fingers. She had found it that evening without having to search. She didn't move. She sat in the light of the small table lamp and stared at the screen, and the dryer downstairs completed one turn, then began another, then another after that, and at some point it stopped entirely, and the whole building fell silent, and she was still sitting there. The clock in the corner of the screen changed from 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock. Her eyes were dry. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury like taking a cab, like replacing a napkin, and she had cut it from her budget a long time ago. She only stared at the dead man's hand resting on the head of a dog that had laid its head in her lap that evening. And she thought about another man who had sat across from her for 3 hours, a man who had paid in cash inside a restaurant he could have bought outright, a man whose face had gone white when the dog rose, and she began to understand that an absence, shaped like a person, had been sitting at that table with them all evening, and neither of them had spoken its name. At last she stood. She walked to the door, to the hook, to the uniform hanging there. She slipped her hand into the apron pocket beneath the order pad and the 2 pens. She took out the leather strap. She carried it back to the table and laid it beside the laptop beneath the lamplight for the first time in 2 years. 2 years and 3 months earlier, Holly's Corolla died in the alley behind Ardith House on a rainy night, and she sat inside for 10 minutes turning the key before accepting that the engine wasn't going to start. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. She had just finished her second shift at a bar on Broadway, where she worked 3 extra nights a week. Rory's private estate sat just a few blocks away on the quiet ridge overlooking the historic district, and as she calculated in her head that walking home in the rain would leave her with barely 3 hours of sleep, she had no idea how close she was to the estate's heavy iron gates. She opened the car door and stepped into the rain, and then she heard it. It wasn't a whine. Large dogs don't whine. It was breathing, the wrong kind of breathing, too shallow and too fast, coming from behind the row of dumpsters, where the Ardith House kitchen threw out its trash every night. Holly stood motionless in the rain for 10 seconds. She knew she should leave. Then she walked around the dumpster. The animal lay on its side on the wet concrete, so black she almost didn't see it, so large that for the first half-second her mind refused to call it a dog. It didn't bark. It only opened one eye and looked at her. No collar, no leash, no tag. Holly knelt about 3 feet away and did the thing 4 years at Tufts had carved into her more deeply than her own name. She looked before she touched, pale gums, a respiratory rate of about 40, far too fast. It was trembling, though whether from cold or shock, it was still too early to tell. Then she saw the left hind leg. The wound was on the inner thigh, just above the knee joint, and the first thing Holly thought, even before she thought about the blood, was that the wound was wrong. It wasn't a tear. When a car ran over an animal, the skin ripped, the edges became ragged, and bits of asphalt dust worked their way inside. A dog bite left 2 parallel lines. This was a single cut, nearly straight, about 5 inches long. Its edges clean as though someone had used a knife, but it wasn't deep enough at either end and was too deep in the middle, and the skin around it had been bruised purple in a band, 2 fingers wide running parallel to the cut. Pressure, not a blade. Something heavy with an edge had clamped around the leg and slid. It took her 3 seconds to understand, and when she did, she felt cold in a place that had nothing to do with the rain. She took off her coat. She wrapped it around the animal's leg, didn't tie it, only pressed, and the dog allowed her to do it. And that was the worst part, because a healthy animal wouldn't let a stranger touch an injured leg. It weighed 154 pounds. She weighed 119. She didn't remember how she got it up 4 flights of stairs. She only remembered stopping on the 3rd floor landing and telling it there was just 1 more floor, as though it understood, and that it kept going. The building prohibited animals. There was a clause in the lease, paragraph 14, and Holly had read it. She spread towels across the bathroom floor, 2 of them, the good one and the bad one. She rinsed the wound with saline she mixed herself, because she had nothing else. She didn't stitch it. She knew she couldn't stitch it. Not without anesthesia, not without sterile instruments. and she knew the edges were straight enough to heal on their own if they were held closed. She used medical tape and strips cut from a towel, and she worked slowly, one layer at a time, evenly spaced, and at some point she realized her hands had stopped shaking and were moving through a sequence she hadn't known she still remembered. Then she took out her phone and photographed it. 4 pictures: a close view of the cut, a close view of the bruised band, a wider picture showing the entire leg, and one with her hand beside the wound for scale. She didn't think about it while she did it. It was habit, at Tufts. They had taught her that a case that wasn't documented was a case that didn't exist. She opened the notes application and typed the date, the time, the estimated weight, the respiratory rate, and a description of the wound, and at the end she typed mechanism of injury undetermined, suspected heavy-edged object, then saved it and forgot about it for 2 years. She sat on the bathroom floor beside the dog until dawn. Eventually, its head grew heavy in her lap. At 6 o'clock in the morning, she took a microchip scanner from the box in the closet, the scanner she had bought with her 3rd-year tip money and never returned, and passed it along the dog's shoulder blades. The machine beeped once. A string of numbers appeared, followed by an owner's name. R. Falco. Holly typed the name into her phone. She didn't need to read beyond the second result. She sat on the bathroom floor with the dog asleep in her lap and read, and she understood immediately, without anyone having to explain it, that if she called the number listed in the chip record, someone would come to this apartment the next morning. They would thank her. They would ask her name. They would remember her name. At 7 o'clock, she cut a strip of leather from her father's old belt, stitched it by hand with white thread because she didn't have black, and made a leash about 2 feet long. She drove the Corolla, which had finally agreed to start, to the address in the record, a tall iron gate at the end of a road with no sidewalk, and stopped about 100 feet away. She opened the door. She removed the leash from its neck. She told it to go, and it went, limping slowly, without looking back, and she sat inside the car until she saw it standing in front of the gate, then drove away before the gate could open. She kept the leash. She had saved a man's dog and then fled from his gratitude, because gratitude from men like that wasn't gratitude. It was a debt, and Holly Quinn already had enough debt. At 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, Matthew Brennan Falco spoke 3 words into the phone and said nothing more. He said, "Holly Quinn, Ardith." 40 hours later, a stiff cardboard envelope lay on his desk, without a logo or a sender's name, about half an inch thick. He didn't open it right away. He left it there all morning and worked around it, signing 2 lease agreements, listening to a 20-minute call about a parcel of land in East Providence, while the envelope remained at the corner of his desk like something dead. By afternoon, he opened it. The first thing he thought was that it was thin. Not thin in the number of pages. Thin in substance. He had read hundreds of files like this in his life, and every one of them contained at least one thing: an arrest for drunk driving, some hidden account, a cousin who had served time, a loan that couldn't be explained. That was how the world worked. No one lived 30 years without leaving a mark. Holly Quinn had left none. No criminal convictions, no arrests, not even a parking ticket since 2020. A clean driver's license due to expire the following year. No credit card debt because she didn't have a credit card. No savings account. She had one checking account at a community bank in Cranston, with an average balance of $217 over the previous 6 months. He turned the page. Tufts University, School of Veterinary Medicine, 4-year program. Grade point average, 3.9. There was a note from the person who had compiled the file, brief and dry, stating that 3.9 placed her at the top of her class. Teaching assistant for 2 semesters. One published paper listing her as a co-author, concerning hind limb trauma in large breed dogs. And then, midway through her final year, a single line: withdrew from program. No reason was given, no request for a leave of absence, no return. Matthew read that line 3 times. He knew what it meant to leave in the middle of the final year. People didn't leave in the middle of the final year. They left during the first year, or the second, while the cost of stopping was still low. Leaving in the 42nd month of a 48-month program was something else. That wasn't giving up. That was something falling from above. The next page told him what had fallen. A woman's name, born in 1961, admitted to a hospital in Providence 3 years earlier, then transferred to a long-term care facility in Warwick 11 weeks later. Beneath it was a table, 37 lines, 37 months, Each line contained a payment date. Matthew ran his finger down the date column and found no gaps. Not one missed month, not one late payment, not one partial payment. For 37 consecutive months, a woman who earned her living through tips had paid a long-term care facility in Warwick on time while maintaining a bank balance of $217. He sat with that page for a very long time. Outside the window, darkness had fallen. The dog lay beneath the desk with its head resting on its front paws, awake. At some point, Matthew realized he was calculating, as he calculated everything, and that the numbers didn't work. There was no possible way. Every month contained a shortfall that the wages of a morning shift waitress couldn't explain, and he turned back through the file and found the answer near the end, beneath the notes section. Another line written by the person who had prepared the report. Subject has worked second shifts at 3 separate establishments from 2023 to the present. Not declared in Ardith House tax records. Toby Keene arrived at 7 o'clock that evening, as he had arrived every Monday evening for 30 years. He sat down, looked at the open file on the desk, and didn't need to ask. He simply read slowly, one page after another, while Matthew watched him. When Toby closed it, he said nothing for nearly 10 seconds. Then he said, "She's perfect." "You say that as though it's an accusation. That's what worries me, Matthew. 37 months, not one mark, not one mistake. Do you know who is that clean? Someone who has been constructed. Someone with another person standing behind them, cleaning everything away. I've sat in this chair for 40 years, and I've never seen a file this clean without a hand somewhere wiping it down." Matthew didn't answer immediately. He turned the file around, opened it to the page with the 37-line table, and pushed it toward Toby. "No," he said. "That's what worries you. I see someone paying her bills." Toby looked at the page. He didn't argue. He never argued. He only smiled the weary smile of a man who had been right too many times to need acknowledgement, and he said, "I hope you're right," then finished his drink and left. Matthew remained alone with the file until nearly midnight. He read it again from the beginning, not because he was searching for something, because he knew there was nothing to find, but because every time he read it, he saw the same thing, and it wouldn't go away. A 27-year-old woman had walked away from the thing she did better than anything else in the world during the 42nd month, and had made 37 consecutive payments on her time ever since. And nowhere in that entire half-inch of paper was there a single line telling him why. He closed the file and sat in the darkness, and the only thing he knew for certain was that he would call her the next day, and he still had no idea what he was going to say. He called on Tuesday afternoon and said nothing about dinner. He said, "I have something to do at 7 o'clock. You can come with me." Holly asked what it was. He said, "You'll see," and hung up, and she stood in the hallway of the laundromat, watching the phone screen go dark, wondering why she hadn't said no. The black car arrived at 10 minutes before 7. They didn't go to a restaurant. They drove east, crossed the bridge, and stopped in front of a low building with a glowing sign that said it was open 24 hours a day. And Holly remained still in her seat for 2 seconds after the engine had gone quiet. She knew this place, not because she had ever been there, because every veterinary student in New England knew places like this. Emergency clinics where the night shift taught people more than they would learn anywhere else in their lives. The dog jumped out before she did. "Routine examination," Matthew said. Once every 6 weeks, he didn't look at her when he spoke. But he had chosen the time, and he had chosen the place. And Holly understood very clearly that she was being placed inside something. She just didn't know what it was. Inside, the air smelled of alcohol and dog food, and something else beneath those 2 scents. Something Holly hadn't smelled in 3 years, and it struck her harder than anything that had happened at table 11. The veterinarian was a woman with short silver hair named Priscilla Nash, and she greeted the dog before she greeted the people. In the examination room, the dog stepped onto the scale, 157 pounds. Dr. Nash looked at the screen, then at the file, and said nothing, and Holly, standing in the corner of the room, understood the entire unspoken conversation in 2 seconds. The number hadn't gone up. "You've done well keeping him at this weight," Dr. Nash said, in the way people spoke when well wasn't the right word. She picked up the stethoscope. Then her phone sounded, and she apologized and stepped outside, and for 7 seconds, the room held only Holly, Matthew, and the dog standing on the scale with both ears lowered. The dog turned its head toward her. Holly picked up the stethoscope. She didn't decide to do it. Her hand was already holding it before thought had any part in the matter. She warmed the diaphragm in her palm for 3 seconds because cold metal startled large dogs, then placed it against the left side of the chest behind the front elbow and closed her eyes. She didn't close them to concentrate. She closed them because that was how she had always done it, and her body remembered. She counted. A heart rate of 82. She moved the stethoscope upward about 3/4 of an inch and listened to the mitral valve. No murmur. She slid it down over the left lung, lower, middle, upper, then crossed to the right, and at the rear right lobe, she paused a little longer. She placed 2 fingers against the fold of skin behind the dog's shoulders, lifted it, released it, and counted silently. 1, 2, nearly 3. She raised the edge of its lip, pressed the gum, and counted again. She did all of it in about 40 seconds without speaking a single word, while Matthew Brennan Falco stood about 5 feet away and didn't move. Dr. Nash returned. She stopped in the doorway. Holly realized she was holding someone else's stethoscope and set it down as quickly as though it were hot. "I'm sorry," she said. "What did you hear?" Holly glanced at Matthew. He didn't help her. He only watched. "The rear right lobe sounds slightly coarse," she said. "It isn't wheezing. Just coarse. It may be nothing. And he's dehydrated. The skin fold took almost 3 seconds to settle, and his gums are slightly tacky. He isn't drinking enough." Dr. Nash said nothing for a moment. Then she stepped forward, placed the stethoscope exactly where Holly had removed it, listened for 10 seconds, and gave one very small nod. "Where did you study?" The room fell silent. The air conditioner hummed. "I didn't finish," Holly said. Dr. Nash was kind enough not to ask anything more. She only said that Holly had heard correctly and turned back to the file, and 10 minutes later, they were outside in the parking lot beneath the high overhead lights, and the dog was drinking water from the plastic bowl attached beside the clinic door, and Holly stood watching it drink without looking at the man beside her. "Why?" Matthew asked. It was the first time in the 2 times they had met that he had asked her a real question, one with a genuine question mark at the end, not a statement disguised as one. Holly didn't answer. She watched the dog empty the water bowl, and then stand there breathing, and she thought about a hospital corridor in Providence, and a paper she had signed during the 42nd month, and she thought about how many times she had practiced the answer to this question alone in her car, and had never once spoken it aloud to anyone. "Because someone had to stay," she said. Matthew said nothing, not one word. He didn't say he understood. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't do what everyone did, turning another person's pain into an opportunity to appear kind. He simply stood beneath the yellow light and looked at her. And Holly didn't know, because she didn't turn toward him, that in that moment, the wealthiest man in Rhode Island was looking at something he recognized immediately, the one thing in the world he couldn't buy back for himself. Then he opened the car door for her, and neither of them spoke during the entire drive home, and for the first time in 3 years, Holly didn't feel that silence was something she had to fill. The car didn't head toward her home. Holly realized it at the second intersection, and she said nothing because she had spent 3 years learning not to ask questions when the answers would only make things worse. They drove north, crossed the river, and stopped in front of a building made of glass and dark stone that she had probably passed 200 times on the bus and had never once looked up at. There was no sign, no number. The driver turned off the engine, stepped out, and closed the door behind him, and Holly understood that his leaving the car was part of whatever was about to happen. The dog lay on the floor between them, breathing evenly. Matthew didn't turn toward her. He stared straight through the windshield, both hands resting on his thighs, and said, "My name is Matthew Brennan Falco." He said it like a man setting something heavy on a table. There was nothing in his voice, no apology, no challenge. None of the emphasis people used when they wanted to watch your reaction. He simply put it down between them. Holly heard the first 2 names, and nothing happened. Brennan. She had carried that name with her all week. Then she heard the third, Falco. There was one very brief moment, perhaps half a second, when Holly Quinn wasn't sitting inside this car. She was sitting on the white-tiled bathroom floor at 6 o'clock in the morning with a sleeping dog in her lap and a scanner in her hand. 5 letters glowing on its green screen. R. Falco. She had read that name before she had ever seen this man's face. She had searched it online in the darkness and understood, within the space of 2 search results, that there were certain names in Providence that wise people returned before walking away. Her hands remained perfectly still in her lap. She had learned to keep them still at 19, at another table, in another room, when a doctor told her the damage on the left side was permanent. She didn't move. She simply let the name pass through her, and she thought, with a calmness and clarity that surprised even her, that she had returned the dog to the right home. Matthew was still looking through the windshield. "I knew you would look it up," he said. "Everyone does. I only wanted you to hear it from me first, so you wouldn't have to pretend the next time." Then he said the rest, more quickly now, like a man reading the terms of a contract he didn't want anyone to misunderstand. "You can get out of the car now. The door isn't locked. The transit station is 3 blocks away. Or I can call a car for you. Whichever you prefer. I won't call you again. I won't come to your workplace. No one will look for you, no one will question you, and no one will mention your name." He paused. "That isn't a promise, Miss Quinn. Promises can be broken. It's an order I gave before I picked you up tonight, and it has been in effect since 10 minutes before 7. Outside, another car passed, and its headlights swept across his face before vanishing. It was the first time Holly had seen him clearly enough to understand how tired he was. She didn't open the door. She sat there in her thin coat, on the leather seat of a car worth more than everything she had ever owned put together, and heard herself say, "You think I'm afraid of you." He turned toward her. It was the first time all evening that he had turned. "Most people are, I know," she said. "But you're wrong about what frightens me." She looked outside at the dark glass building with no name on it. "I'm afraid of my landlord. His name is Rickert. He's 58 years old, and he answers the door in slippers. And last February, I handed him $900 4 days late, and he took it and told me there were 7 people waiting for that apartment. He didn't threaten me. He didn't need to. He only told me a fact and let me carry it back to my room by myself." She turned to look at him. "You've never had to fear another person over $900 in your life. You don't know what that feels like. So when you sit here and tell me in that voice that no one will come looking for me, you think you're giving me something enormous, but you're giving me something I already had. No one looks for me, Mr. Brennan. No one ever has." The dog sighed on the floor between them. Matthew said nothing for so long that Holly began to wonder whether she really should get out of the car. Then he said, very softly, "Falco, what?" "You called me Brennan," he said. "Everyone calls me Brennan. That's the name I use when I want people to treat me like an ordinary man." He looked directly at her. "You just told me something no one has said to me in 10 years. I thought you should know the other name too." Holly sat perfectly still and didn't tell him that she had known that name 2 years and 3 months before he did. The woman was standing beside Holly's Corolla in the employee parking lot behind Ardith House at 1 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, and she had been there long enough for the coffee in her hand to stop steaming. She was about 33, wearing a gray coat, flat shoes, and no makeup, and she held an identification card open in her other hand, as though she had already calculated that Holly would need to see it before she listened to anything else. "Merritt Lowe," she said. "Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Rhode Island. I'm standing out here instead of going inside, because I don't want anyone in the restaurant to see me speaking with you. You can believe that or not." Holly looked at the identification card. She had been on her feet for 9 hours, her legs hurt, and she had 37 minutes before her second shift. "I have to go to work, I know. The place on Broadway, shift starts at 2 o'clock. I'll take 10 minutes of your time." There was nothing in her voice. That was the first thing Holly noticed, and it frightened her more than anything else could have. She had prepared herself for someone to threaten her. She hadn't prepared herself for someone who spoke to her as though she were an adult. "You've had dinner with Matthew Brennan Falco twice in the past 10 days, Lowe said. "I'm not asking you about that. I'm telling you that I know, so we don't waste time." She took a sip of cold coffee. "There are 2 ways this can go, Miss Quinn. The first way, I serve you with a subpoena. You'll receive it at work because that's the address I have. Someone will hand it to you in front of your manager. You'll have to hire an attorney, or choose not to, and you'll sit before a federal grand jury and answer every question I ask under oath. You won't get to choose the questions. You won't get to choose the date. And everyone at Ardith House will know within an hour." Holly said nothing. "The second way," Lowe said, "you talk to me. 3 months. Nothing dramatic. You go to dinner as you've been doing, you go home, and you tell me what you heard. You don't have to ask anything. You don't have to do anything. You simply don't forget. Holly waited for the rest. She knew there was more. People didn't stand in a parking lot for 90 minutes to make an offer with nothing inside it. And in return, Lo set her coffee on the roof of the Corolla. Your mother has applied for long-term care Medicaid 3 times, she said. The first time September of 2023. Denied. The second was April of last year. Denied. The third was in November. It's still pending, and it will be denied because it contains the same error as the first 2. She didn't look at any papers. She had memorized it. All 3 applications were returned because of the asset declaration section. There is an account jointly held in your parents' names at a bank that merged with another institution in 2018. That account was closed a long time ago, and its balance is 0. But it still appears in the federal system as an undeclared asset. The Rhode Island Department of Human Services doesn't read applications, Miss Quinn. They run cross-checks. The machine sees an account, the machine flags it, and the reviewer denies the application. For 3 years, you've been fighting a deadline of data from a bank that no longer exists. Holly stood perfectly still in the afternoon sunlight. I'm not telling you this to astonish you, Lo said. I'm telling you because you have a right to know. You filed the application yourself 3 times. You called them, I know you did. You called 17 times in 2024, and you spoke to 5 different people, and not one of them told you what I just told you. Not because they were cruel, because they weren't allowed to, and because none of them had access to both systems at the same time. Silence settled between them. Across the parking lot, a delivery truck backed up with a steady beeping sound. I have that access, Lo said. I make 1 phone call. Not to someone I know. To a department. I read them the case number, point out the matching error, and within 6 weeks your mother's application is approved, and you won't have to pay another cent for the rest of her life. Holly could hear her own heart beating. That's what I have, Lo said. Not money. I'm not offering you money, Miss Quinn. Money would make you despise me, and it would ruin you in court. I'm offering you a phone call you aren't permitted to make for yourself. She lifted the coffee cup from the roof. I don't hate you. I don't think you're a bad person. I've read your file, and I think you're one of the most decent people this job has ever placed in front of me. And that's why I've been standing here for 90 minutes instead of sending a subpoena. She walked past Holly toward her car, then stopped. But I want you to understand one thing before you decide. I'm not the first person in your life to take something away from you. I'm only the first person to offer you a fair price for it. She held out a business card. Holly didn't remember taking it. She drove to the place on Broadway, parked, and sat inside her car for 11 minutes. Then she opened the door and vomited onto the pavement between 2 cars, twice, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, went inside to begin her shift, and smiled at 41 people over the next 7 hours. For the next 3 days, Holly answered no one. Matthew sent 1 message, a single sentence, "Are you all right?" And she stared at it for a long time before locking the screen. Delia called twice and left a voicemail Holly didn't listen to. Merritt Lowe's business card lay on the table beside the laptop and the leather leash, 3 objects arranged in a straight line beneath the lamp, and Holly walked past them every morning and every evening without touching any of them. On Sunday, she drove down to Warwick. The facility stood about 100 yards from the road, a 2-story brick building with a waiting area that smelled of lemon disinfectant covering something else underneath. The woman at the desk knew Holly's name and no longer needed to check her paperwork after 3 years. Room 32, 2 beds, a fabric curtain drawn between them. The old woman in the other bed was named Winifred, 91 years old, and no one had visited her since June, and Holly always greeted her first every time, because it took 2 seconds and cost nothing. There was no window on her mother's side of the room. The window was on Winifred's side. That was how beds were assigned, not out of cruelty, but according to the order people were admitted. Holly's mother sat in the chair beside the bed with the green wool blanket across her lap, and the left hand Holly had taught herself not to look at directly. She turned her head when Holly entered, and she said, "Holly." Some days she said nothing. Some days she called her Kathleen, the name of her younger sister, who had died in 2011. Some days she looked at Holly as though she were a member of the staff, polite and distant, asking whether she was new. Holly had counted. Over 37 months, about half had been good halves, and there was no way to know beforehand. And she had learned to enter that room without carrying hope with her, because hope was something that came at a price, too. Today was a good half. Holly sat on the edge of the bed and held her mother's right hand, the hand that still obeyed her, and they talked about the weather and about how lunch that day had been fish, and her mother hated fish, and for 15 minutes everything was so nearly normal that Holly forgot where she was. Then her mother asked, "Are you still studying veterinary medicine?" She asked gently, without hesitation, in the way a mother continued a conversation she believed they had begun the week before. She didn't know. She had never known. The stroke had come during the 42nd month, and Holly had signed the papers withdrawing from the program 3 weeks later, while her mother still couldn't speak, and by the time she could speak again, her daughter was still in North Grafton in her mind, still wearing a white coat, still on her way toward becoming the thing they had both counted down to for 10 years. For 3 years, Holly had been given one opportunity every week to correct her. "Yes," Holly said. "I'm still studying," her mother smiled. That was the part Holly could never prepare for, not the question, the smile. Her entire face changed, the half that could still move, and she squeezed Holly's hand with what little strength remained and said, "I knew it. I keep telling Winifred. I tell her my daughter is going to be a doctor." On the other side of the curtain, Winifred said nothing. Perhaps she was sleeping. Perhaps she had heard those words 600 times. "How much longer, sweetheart?" "Not much longer. I'll come," her mother said. "To the graduation. I'll come. You tell me the date so I can tell the people here." Holly said yes. She said yes, and she smiled, and she kept her face still for another 40 minutes, and she read her mother 2 pages from a book they had already read 4 times, and when her mother fell asleep, Holly pulled the blanket higher, switched off the reading lamp, said goodbye to Winifred, left the room, crossed the lobby, went out to the parking lot, and sat inside the Corolla. She didn't cry. She sat there with her hands on the steering wheel and did what she always did. She calculated $4,100 a month. That was the price of a shared room, a private room on the 2nd floor on the south side, with a window overlooking a row of trees, cost $5,800. She had asked the price during the 2nd month and had never asked again. The difference was $1,700 a month, which was about $57 a day, which was about 11 tables where people left 18%. She had counted long enough to know there was no arrangement of numbers that could produce that result. Not with a 2nd shift, not with a 3rd, not in this lifetime. Then she thought about one telephone call. 1 call, 6 weeks, and it wasn't merely a private room. It was more than that. It was the entire number disappearing. It was 37 months coming to an end. It was a woman in room 32 being moved somewhere with a window because, for the first time in her life, she would no longer be a line of debt. And Holly thought about the price. The price was a man who had sat in a car and told her no one would come looking for her. The price was a man who had opened his wallet and counted cash with 2 fingers inside a restaurant he could bought outright, not because he preferred cash, but because his name was printed on the card and he hadn't wanted her to see it. Holly sat in the parking lot of a long-term care facility in Warwick until the hallway lights inside changed their nighttime setting. Then she started the engine and drove back to Providence, and she still hadn't decided anything at all. She texted him at 11 o'clock on Monday night, 3 words, "Need to meet," and he answered within 40 seconds, "Tomorrow at 7. "The car will come," she said. "No," she said, "at my place." He didn't ask why. He came alone without a driver, and he had to climb 19 steps, while the dog went ahead of him and stopped at every landing to wait. The apartment was so small that when he stood upright inside it, it became a different apartment. Holly pulled out the only chair for him and sat on the edge of the bed. Beneath the floor, the dryer began another cycle. She could have said nothing. That was what she had thought for 2 days. She could sit quietly for 3 months, listen and remember and do nothing wrong by any definition the law cared about, and her mother would have a window. No one in the world would ever know. Not even him, especially him. She said, "There's a federal prosecutor named Merritt Lowe. She stopped me in the parking lot last Thursday. She wants me to have dinner with you for 3 months and then tell her what you say." Matthew didn't move. What did she offer? "My mother's Medicaid application has been denied 3 times because of an error in a system I'm not allowed to see." She has access to it. She said she could make one phone call. Holly told him the rest, leaving out nothing, including the part where she had sat inside her car for 11 minutes, and including the fact that she still hadn't answered Lowe. He listened to all of it. Then he asked, "Why are you telling me?" "Because I haven't decided," she said. "And I don't want to decide while you don't know." He gave one very slow nod, and Holly realized that Lowe hadn't surprised him at all, not for a single second, and that the only thing he was trying to understand was the fact that she had climbed 4 flights of stairs to tell him first. Then she stood, walked to the table, and picked up the leather leash. She placed it between them on the plastic tablecloth. He looked at it. He didn't understand, and for that half-second Holly saw nothing at all on his face, only the face of a man waiting for information. "The night your brother lost the dog," she said, "wasn't the night he died. It was 3 months earlier," she told him. She told him about the Corolla dying in the alley behind Ardith House at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, and the wrong breathing behind the row of dumpsters. She told him about the dog lying on its side on the wet concrete, without a collar or tag, its gums pale, its breathing at 40 breaths a minute. She told him about the wound on the inside of its left hind thigh, one cut about 5 inches long, with clean edges, too shallow at both ends and too deep in the middle, with a bruised band about 2 fingers wide running parallel beside it. She told him that she had knelt in the rain and thought that the wound was wrong. She told him about the 4 flights of stairs and the 3rd floor landing, where she had told the dog there was only 1 more floor. She told him about the towels and the saline she had mixed herself and the medical tape, and how she hadn't stitched the wound because she knew she wasn't allowed to. She told him about the scanner she had bought with her 3rd-year tip money, and the 5 letters on the green screen at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the name she had typed into her phone, and how 2 search results had been all she needed. She told him about her father's old belt, the white thread because she didn't have black, the 100 feet between her car and the gate, and how she had driven away before the gate could open. Then she fell silent. Matthew said nothing. He sat in the plastic chair that was too small for him, inside a 4th-floor apartment above a laundromat, and stared at the leather leash hand stitched with white thread on the table, and he didn't move for so long that the dryer beneath the floor completed 1 cycle and began another. The dog rose, walked over, and rested its head in Holly's lap, and neither of them looked at it. At last he spoke, and his voice sounded unlike any voice she had ever heard from him. "Rory told me someone had brought him back. He was still staring at the leash. He called me that morning. He said the dog was standing outside the gate at 7:15, its leg wrapped with a towel and medical tape, wrapped correctly, and there was a handmade leather leash lying on the ground about 6 feet away. He said someone had kept him all night and treated him with more kindness than a stranger needed to show." He paused. "He looked for you for 2 weeks. He asked every veterinary clinic in 3 counties. He asked the rescue shelters. He left a notice at the pet food store on Hope Street for an entire month. He wasn't trying to find out who had hurt the dog. He wanted to thank you." Holly looked down at her hand resting on the dog's head. "I didn't want to be thanked," she said. Matthew looked up. "I know," he said. "That's why he never found you. He returned home at 1 o'clock in the morning and didn't go to sleep." There was one detail Holly had mentioned that he couldn't set aside, and it wasn't the wound, not the 4 flights of stairs, not the leash. It was this: no collar. That dog had worn a collar every day of its life. It wore a brown leather collar with a brass tag, and Rory had stamped the telephone number onto that tag himself, with a punch set he bought at a hardware store in Cranston, and Matthew had teased him about it for 2 months. A dog that ran away from home would still be wearing its collar. A dog that had been taken wouldn't. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Matthew sat in his study with a cup of cold coffee and opened a folder he hadn't touched in 2 years. After Rory died, everything connected to that house had been packed and brought here: papers, contracts, maintenance records, and the security system backups that the company responsible for the installation was contractually required to retain for 6 years. He wasn't searching blindly. He had a date and a window of time. He entered the date Holly had given him. He searched the period between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning. The system returned 11 entries. 10 were motion sensor activations along the eastern fence. Something Matthew knew was caused by raccoons, which had triggered the sensors 3 or 4 times every night for 6 years. The 11th entry was the front gate, status, open. Time, shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning. Duration open, 22 seconds, method. Keypad valid code. Matthew read the line 3 times. He felt nothing. That was what he would remember about that night later, that he felt nothing, like a man who had been cut deeply and looked down, knowing the pain was coming but hadn't arrived yet. 22 seconds. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a malfunction. If the gate had failed, the log would have recorded a mechanical error. The system would have sent an alert to the security company, and there would have been a telephone call in the records. There was no alert. There was no call. Someone had opened the gate by entering the correct code on the keypad from inside the property, shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning, then closed it 22 seconds later. Matthew sat perfectly still. The code to Rory's gate wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't in the service contract, and it wasn't stored in the central system because Rory was the kind of man who didn't trust central systems. He programmed the code manually on the property, changed it twice a year, and gave it to 3 people. He gave it to Matthew. He kept it himself. And he gave it to Tobias Keene because Toby had been the man with the keys to everything in this family since before Matthew could walk, because Toby was the father they trusted more than their own father trusted both of his sons combined. One of those men was dead. One was Matthew. And Matthew knew exactly where he had been that night. He had been in Boston, and 6 people could testify to that under oath. He sat with the number glowing on the screen for a long time. Then he did something he had avoided doing for 2 years. He entered the second date, the date in March. The same folder, the same system, the same period between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning. He already knew what the official records said because he had read them 40 times, because he had paid 3 people to review them again, and all 3 had said the same thing. No one had entered the property that night. The gate hadn't opened. That was the first line of the report, and it was the reason the incident had been classified as an accident. The screen returned 9 entries. 8 were from the eastern fence. The 9th was the front gate. Status, open time. Shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 seconds. Method keypad valid code. The same gate, the same code. The same hour of the night, only 4 minutes apart. The same duration. 22 seconds, not even 1 second of difference. 3 months apart. Matthew set down his coffee cup. He didn't shatter it. He didn't stand. He sat in the dark room with the light from the screen across his face and allowed the calculation to complete itself, slowly, one piece at a time, the way the worst calculations always did. The official record said the gate hadn't opened, the security company's backup. The copy no one remembered existed because it was buried inside a 14-page service clause, said that it had. Someone had read the report before it reached Matthew. Someone had possessed the time, the authority, and the precise knowledge of which line needed to disappear. And 3 months earlier, that same person had stood at the same keypad at the same hour and entered the same code, holding the gate open for exactly 22 seconds, long enough for something to leave and not long enough for anything else to enter. The dog hadn't run away. It hadn't jumped the fence, dug underneath it, or slipped through when the gate opened for a car. It had been taken outside. Someone had entered the code for it. Someone had removed the collar with the brass tag from its neck first, and 3 months later, the same hand had repeated the exact same act at the same hour for the same number of seconds. The first time hadn't been a rehearsal. It was the removal of Rory's silent guardian. Toby knew the fiercely loyal mastiff would never let anyone harm his master, so he had stripped the dog's collar to erase its identity, opened the gate, and driven it away into the night unaware that the heavy iron gate would slide shut on its leg and trap the evidence of his betrayal in its mechanical memory. The house in Cranston was the only one on the street that still had its original aluminum siding from 1971, and Matthew hadn't been there in 11 months. The caregiver opened the door and asked no questions. Uncle Conrad sat in his wheelchair beside the living room window, where he sat every afternoon, with a plaid blanket across his lap and a baseball game playing silently on the television. He was 71 years old, and there were days when he was completely himself, and there were days when he asked Matthew whether he had eaten 3 times in 40 minutes. "Your father stood exactly where you're standing," Conrad said when Matthew entered, without greeting him, and he never sat down either. Matthew sat. He didn't circle around the subject. He no longer had time for that, and he knew that with his uncle, The window could close at any moment. I need you to tell me about Toby Keene. Conrad didn't turn away from the window. He looked out at the yard, where there was a bird feeder no bird had visited since fall. Toby, he said, as though tasting the name. Toby drove for your father in 1982. He was in his early 20s. He was the only man in this house who never asked your father a single question. He fell silent for about 20 seconds. Matthew waited. I need to know whether he had the code to Rory's gate. He had the code to everything, Conrad said. He always did. Then he added in the same voice, the voice of a man remarking that it might rain over the weekend. He loved your father, you know. People don't understand that. They keep thinking it was loyalty. Loyalty is something you pay for. What Toby had couldn't be bought. Matthew remained still. Rory wasn't your father's son. Conrad said it without changing his posture, without changing his rhythm, and without looking at Matthew. He continued staring at the bird feeder. Your mother and Toby, he said. 1983. Your mother was 26, Toby was 21. Your father spent 8 months in Chicago that year. That was all it was. Nothing more, nothing romantic. People always think these things have to be enormous. It wasn't enormous. It was only 8 months. The picture on the television changed. Someone scored. Your father knew, Conrad said. He knew before the boy could walk. Someone told him. He came home, sat in the kitchen all night, and the next morning he went to work, and he never said a word about it to anyone for 39 years. He raised him. He placed him ahead of you because he was the eldest, and in this family, the eldest was the eldest. He never treated him 1 inch differently. He paused, and he kept Toby. That's the part no one ever understood. He kept Toby at his right hand for 40 years. Matthew didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He had understood while his uncle was still speaking. Understood in the way a door opens and light enters, and everything in the room suddenly takes the shape it had always possessed. His father hadn't forgiven Toby. His father had found the only punishment heavy enough. He made Tobias Keene sit in the chair at his right hand for 41 years and watch his own son grow up calling another man father and stand at his wedding and bring him birthday gifts every March without being permitted to say a single word. Not once, not ever, Uncle, Matthew said. What was Rory planning to do before he died? Conrad turned his head for the first time. His eyes were clear. This was one of the good days, and both men knew it. He came here, he said, in January of that year. He sat in the same chair you're sitting in now and told me he was about to do something. And he wanted someone to know. He said he had met someone at the federal courthouse. A woman. He said he was tired. He said he was supposed to take your father's chair in 3 months, and he didn't want that chair. He wanted the chair to disappear. Conrad shrugged, a very small movement. I told him not to tell anyone. He told me he had already told one person. Matthew sat perfectly still. He said he had told Toby, Conrad said. He said Toby was the only person in this house who had never lied to him. Outside the window, the wind moved the empty bird feeder. Conrad turned back toward it. I've thought about that for a long time, he said, his voice still unchanged, still the voice of a man discussing the weather. I think Toby spent 41 years building something he was never allowed to claim credit for. His name wasn't on anything. He had no children. He had nothing except what he built with his own 2 hands and that chair at your father's right. He tapped the wheelchair armrest twice. Then the son he wasn't allowed to call, his son stood up and said he was going to hand all of it to a prosecutor. And Toby had to choose. Matthew stood. He didn't thank him. He didn't say goodbye. He walked to the door and there he stopped and looked back, while his uncle continued staring into the yard. He chose what he built, Conrad said without looking up. People always choose what they build. That's the worst part of human beings, Matthew. It isn't evil. It's that. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, and the entire thing took roughly 4 hours, and no one touched anyone. At 11:40, Holly's phone vibrated while she was carrying 2 plates to table 6. She let it ring until her shift ended. The call was from the billing office at the facility in Warwick, from a woman named Deborah, whom Holly had spoken with dozens of times over 3 years, and her voice sounded different. She was reading from a sheet of paper. She said that during a routine internal review, the facility had discovered an error in the classification of the patient's level of care dating back to April of the previous year, that the patient should have been classified at level 3 rather than level 2, that the difference was being charged retroactively under the signed contract, and that the current account balance had been updated. Holly asked what the balance was. Deborah read out a number, $88,000. Holly stood in the hallway behind the kitchen beside the broom closet, and she heard herself ask in a very calm voice how 14 months of difference could possibly add up to that amount, and Deborah said she was very sorry, that she was only reading what the system showed, and that she could mail Holly a detailed statement. Holly asked whether she could appeal. Deborah said yes, of course. There was a process. She could file an objection within 30 days, and a review board would consider it within 90 days of receipt. Holly asked what happened while she waited. Deborah was silent for 2 seconds. Then she said that while the appeal was pending, the overdue balance would still remain enforceable under the contract, and that if the account stayed delinquent for more than 60 days, the facility had the right, under Section 9, to issue a notice transferring the patient. She apologized 3 times. Holly believed her. That was the most terrible part. No one had done anything wrong. Deborah hadn't done anything wrong. The review board hadn't done anything wrong. There was a line in a contract Holly had signed 3 years earlier, in a hospital corridor, at 3 o'clock in the morning, and someone had just read that line again for the first time in 3 years, and everything that followed was entirely legal. At 2:10, the manager called her into his office. His name was Halloran. He had been at Ardith House for 19 years, and Holly had worked under him for 3, and he had eaten birthday cake with her in the kitchen twice. He didn't invite her to sit. He said the restaurant was restructuring its morning schedule, and that today would be her last day. Holly asked why. He said there was no why, that it was a staffing decision. She asked whether she had done something wrong. He said no. She asked again. He said no, Holly, you haven't done anything wrong. And he said it to the desk. He didn't look her in the eyes once during those 4 minutes. He handed her an envelope containing her paycheck for the week, already signed, already printed in advance, and Holly looked at the date printed on it and saw that it was yesterday's date. She took off her apron in the hallway. Delia ran after her all the way into the parking lot, both hands flying everywhere, asking what had just happened, saying she would speak to Halloran, saying none of it made any sense. And Holly said it was all right and hugged her and drove away because she knew Delia couldn't do anything, and she didn't want Delia to try. The phone rang at 6 o'clock that evening from an unfamiliar number, Miss Quinn. A man's voice said, "My name is Tobias Keene. I've been a friend of the Brennan-Falco family for 40 years. His voice was warm. That was what Holly would never forget afterward. He sounded like an uncle calling to ask how she was doing. I heard you've had an unpleasant day. You did this, Miss Quinn," Toby said very gently. "I didn't do anything. I sit on the board of the company that owns 11 long-term care facilities across New England. I've held that position for 9 years. I didn't call anyone. I didn't ask anyone to do anything. I merely asked one question during a meeting about whether our facilities were reviewing levels of care according to the proper schedule. That was a board member's question. It was my responsibility. Everything that happened afterward was done by other people according to proper procedure, and you could sue every one of them and you would lose." Holly said nothing. "As for Mr. Halloran," Toby continued, "I've never met the man in my life, but he leases his property from a company in which I own shares, and his lease expires in September, and I haven't said a single word to him about that either. He figured it out on his own. People always figure it out on their own, Miss Quinn. That's what people like you never understand about people like me. We rarely have to ask for anything." There was a sound at the other end of the line, the sound of a teacup being set onto a saucer. "I'm not threatening you," Toby said. "I want you to understand that very clearly. Nothing I've just said is a threat, and if you're recording this call, you may give it to anyone you choose, and they'll tell you exactly what I just told you. The past 4 hours have been entirely legal from beginning to end." He paused. "This isn't a threat, Miss Quinn. This is a preview." Merritt Lowe called on Friday morning and said only one sentence. "My offer expires at 5 o'clock this afternoon." Holly said she would come. She arrived at 2 o'clock, without an attorney, without anyone beside her, and sat in a windowless conference room on the 7th floor of the Federal Building on Kennedy Plaza, with a cardboard box resting on her lap. Lowe entered with a graying man she introduced as an investigator but didn't name. "You've made your decision." "I have." Lowe sat down. She opened a file, and Holly saw that typed documents were already inside, printed and waiting for signatures. They had prepared for her. "Before we begin, I need to make something clear," Lowe said. The agreement lasts 3 months. You'll receive training. You won't wear a recording device during the first week. I won't wear a wire, Holly said. There was a silence of about 3 seconds. The investigator stopped writing. Miss Quinn, I won't wear a wire, Holly repeated in the same voice, no louder than before. I won't have dinner with someone and then come home and tell you what he said. I can't do that, and I don't want anything I'd have to do that to receive. She placed the box on the table. But I have this. Lo didn't reach for it. She looked at the box as though it might explode. What is it? Medical records, Holly said. For a dog, she opened the lid. Inside were a stack of printed pages, a soft-cover notebook, and an old phone sealed inside a zippered plastic bag. I studied at Tufts for 3.5 years, Holly said. They taught us one thing before they ever taught us how to hold a scalpel. They said a case that isn't documented is a case that doesn't exist. You record the date. You record the time. You take measurements. You take photographs. You do it even when you're tired, even when the animal is going to die, even when no one may ever read it, because you don't know who will need it or when. She pushed the printed pages toward Lo. I didn't finish, but I never lost that habit. Lo picked up the stack. The first page was a screenshot from a notes application, typed in haste, filled with uneven abbreviations. A date in December, 2 years and 3 months earlier. Estimated weight, 157 pounds. Respiratory rate, 40. Pale gums, capillary refill time of 3 seconds. Wound on the inner left hind thigh, approximately 5 inches long, clean edges, uneven depth, accompanied by a bruised band about 1 1/5 inches wide running parallel to the upper edge. Mechanism of injury undetermined. Suspected heavy object with an edge. No collar. The next page contained photographs, 4 of them. Lo studied the second one the longest. The close view of the bruised band running parallel to the cut, and Holly watched the woman's face change very slowly, like someone staring at a painting, and suddenly seeing a second image hidden inside it. That wound wasn't caused by a car, Holly said. It wasn't caused by a knife. It wasn't caused by another animal. Something heavy, with a flat edge, moved sideways, caught its leg, then slid. I didn't know what it was that night. I only documented it because I didn't know. She placed her hand on the phone inside the plastic bag. Last week I learned what it was. She said nothing more. She let Lo arrive there on her own. The investigator arrived first. He set down his pen and said very quietly, "The gate." Lo turned back to the second photograph. An automatic iron gate closing, against the hind leg of an animal passing through. The lower edge of the gate frame, flat-edged, moving sideways, stopping, then sliding. The photographs still contain the original data, Holly said. I've never transferred them anywhere. They're still on the old phone. You'll see the coordinates. You'll see the time. Lo opened the plastic bag. She didn't ask for the password. Holly had written it by hand on a slip of paper attached to the lid of the box. The investigator connected the phone to his laptop, and for 40 seconds, the only sound in the room was the hum of the fan. Then he turned the screen around. The first photograph. The date. Coordinates for the alley behind Ardith House. Time taken 1:47 in the morning. That was when I found him, Holly said. He had already traveled some distance. The injury happened earlier, close to 2 o'clock in the morning, somewhere not far from where I found him. Lo didn't move. The official report on Rory Falco's death says the gate at his house didn't open on the night he died, Holly said. I don't know anything about that night. I was never there. I only know that 3 months earlier, that same gate closed on a dog's leg, shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning. And I have the photographs, and I have the time, and I've had them for 2 years without knowing what I was holding. A long silence followed. At last, Lo looked up. You understand that I'll need you to testify about this. You understand that you're doing this voluntarily. Yes, Miss Quinn, Lo said, and her voice had lost the flatness it had carried for 4 years. Do you know what you've just given me? Holly closed the lid of the box. Yes, she said. I've just given you a name. But it isn't the name you wanted. The meeting took place at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning on the 14th floor, inside the room with the walnut table Matthew's father had bought in 1994. The 4 men who led the 4 branches sat along both sides. Toby occupied the place where he had always sat, to the right of the chair at the head of the table, the chair he had occupied for 41 years. The dog lay beneath the table. Matthew set a thin file in front of himself and didn't open it. I've begun an internal review of Rory's death, he said. I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from somewhere else. No one spoke for about 4 seconds. Then Toby leaned forward, placed both hands on the table, and spoke in the warm voice he had used his entire life so he would never have to raise it. "Before we go any further," he said, "I think there's one question worth asking. How objective can this review be when the man conducting it is sleeping with a waitress the federal government has approached twice in 3 weeks?" The room went silent in the way a room does when someone has said something true and filthy in the same breath. The head of the construction branch looked down at his hands. No one looked at Matthew. Matthew didn't become angry. He didn't raise his voice, strike the table, or do anything the 4 men in that room had quietly prepared themselves to witness. He simply remained seated and allowed the words to lie between them for another 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to hear them a second time inside their own minds. Then he spoke. "I had dinner with a woman whose identity I didn't know until I sat down across from her. She didn't know my name. She didn't know what I did. She hasn't accepted a single dollar from me, and she refused what the federal government offered her, something I won't describe here because it isn't the business of this table." He looked around the room, one man at a time, without hurry. "What I've brought here today is the security system log from the gate at my brother's house, an access code known by only 3 people in this world, and 2 years of documents bearing your signature at the bottom. None of those things has anything to do with whom I have dinner with." He paused. "If you want this table to discuss my private life, instead of discussing the night of March 14th, Toby, then I'm prepared to let them decide right now which one of us should be answering questions." No one moved. Matthew opened the file. He took out a printed sheet and didn't hand it to anyone. He simply placed it on the walnut table, pushed it toward the center, and turned it so it faced Toby. It was a photograph, a close view of the inner left hind thigh of a dog, a cut measuring 5 inches, with clean edges and a bruised band, a little over 1 inch wide running parallel above it. In the lower right corner of the page, the photograph's original data had been printed in 3 small lines. The date, the coordinates, and the time the photograph was taken, 1:47 in the morning. Beside it, Matthew placed a second sheet, a single entry from the security system log from that same night, front gate, opened, keypad valid code, 22 seconds. Then the third sheet, the same gate 3 months later on the night of March 14th, opened, keypad valid code, 22 seconds. No one in the room said anything. The head of the union branch reached out, pulled the page closer, read it, then read it again. Beneath the table, the dog released a long breath. 3 months before he died, Matthew said, someone stood at that keypad shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning, entered the correct code, and held the gate open for 22 seconds. The dog went out. The gate closed on its leg. It wasn't wearing its collar, Toby. It wore a collar every day of its life, and that night it wasn't wearing one because someone had removed it first. He tapped the third sheet once with his finger. Then 3 months later, the same gate, the same code, the same hour, the same 22 seconds. Not even 1 second of difference. You couldn't have done that the first time. No one could do that the first time. Matthew leaned back. You didn't begin by killing him, Toby. You practiced first. Tobias Keene had occupied the chair on the right for 41 years, and in all those 41 years, he had never been without an answer. He had answers for the police, for the courts, for bankers, for 2 generations of men at the head of the family, for a woman in a parking lot. He looked down at the photograph, he opened his mouth, and nothing came out. The 4 men around the table watched him, and what they saw wasn't a confession. It was far worse. It was a 62-year-old man searching for a sentence, any sentence at all, and for the first time in his entire life, failing to find one. Merritt Lowe received the call that afternoon, and she didn't believe it until Matthew Brennan Falco sat across from her in a windowless conference room with his attorney beside him and a file nearly 2 inches thick on the table. He pushed it toward her. The original security system logs, the untouched backup, 2 years of documents bearing Tobias Keene's signature at the bottom, and the name of the person who had altered the initial report. Lowe asked him why. She asked sincerely, not for the recording, because if I deal with him, Matthew said, he becomes a story. People will tell it for 20 years, and every time they tell it, it'll become a little more beautiful, until eventually he becomes a legend. If you deal with him, he becomes a case file. Case files have numbers. Case files have dates. Case files have names. Lowe looked at him for a long time. You know I'm still pursuing you. I'm counting on it, Matthew said. Tobias Keene was arrested at 8:20 on Sunday morning, in the parking lot of the church where he had attended services every week for 30 years. He didn't run. He held out both hands and asked whether they could wait until the elderly women had all gone outside, and they waited. The price Matthew paid wasn't small. He signed an agreement with the United States Attorney's Office, dissolved 3 branches, accepted permanent oversight of everything that remained by an independent monitor, and added a provision no one in the room had requested. From that day forward, every contract, every decision, every piece of paper in the organization had to bear the name of the person who signed it. Nothing would ever again be signed by no one. His attorney asked why he would bind himself that way. Matthew said, "Because if a decision kills someone, I want to know who signed it." Delia Ward read the news in the Providence Journal on Tuesday morning and called Holly before she finished the second paragraph. She was angry for exactly 10 minutes. She was angry that Holly hadn't told her, angry that she had arranged a date between her best friend and a man she knew nothing about, angry that she had spent 3 years sitting 10 feet from the truth without seeing it. Then she fell silent, and then she began to laugh, the laugh that started with a sneeze. "So I didn't set anyone up at all," Delia said. "I only forced 2 people to say it out loud. Matthew offered to pay the debt one evening in May. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said everything. $88,000. He said it could be finished in a single afternoon." Holly said no. She didn't say it loudly, and she didn't offer a long explanation. "If you pay it," she said, "I'll spend the rest of my life wondering whether I'm sitting here because of you, or because of the bill, and I'll never know the answer." "Neither will you." He didn't argue. That was what Holly remembered most about that night. He didn't call her foolish. He didn't call her proud. He didn't use reason to make her feel small for refusing something sensible. He only nodded. 3 days later, he sent her a message containing a telephone number and a name. The Office of Academic Affairs, Tufts University School of Veterinary Medicine. Beneath it was one line: "Academic reinstatement process for students who withdrew for family reasons. Application deadline June 15th. "I'm not buying your future for you," he wrote. "I only found the telephone number. You make the call." Holly sat on the edge of the bed in her 4th-floor apartment and stared at that number for 40 minutes. Then she called. 4 months later, on a Friday evening, the 2 of them sat at table 11 inside Ardith House. Nothing in Holly's life had turned into a miracle. She still owed $88,000. Her appeal was waiting in the same 90-day queue as every other appeal. Her mother was still in room 32, with the fabric curtain drawn across the middle, and there were days when she called Holly Kathleen. Holly had returned to Tufts, taking 2 courses each semester, the only pace she could afford, and that meant she would graduate 4 years later than she had planned. She still worked the morning shift. At another restaurant on Wickenden Street, a smaller, kinder place she had chosen for herself, and she still counted tips in her head between tables because it was something she would do for the rest of her life, and she was no longer ashamed of it. The dog lay beneath the table, weighing 161 pounds now, and it released a long sigh before falling asleep. Outside, the wind from Narragansett Bay struck the windows, the same wind that had passed through the alley behind this building on a rainy night 2 years and 7 months earlier. No one mentioned it. There was no need. Matthew's phone vibrated once in his pocket. "Delia, don't rush home. Finish dinner for once in your life." He read it, put the phone away, and didn't check it again. Holly laid her hand flat on the white tablecloth. It was the same gesture she had made on the first night, except this time she wasn't holding on to anything. Matthew looked at it for a moment. For 3 years, he hadn't reached for anything without calculating the price first. Then he covered her hand with his, slowly, without hurry, like a man finally setting down something heavy that he had carried a very long way without once allowing himself to rest. It had taken 2 years for a dog to remember her, and 10 minutes for a man who had never met her to sit down in the right chair across from her, so that both of them could finally stop pretending they were still strangers. And perhaps the most thought-provoking part of this story isn't the gate, the photograph, or even the trial. It lies in a telephone number. Because the wealthiest man in this story could have erased $88,000 in a single afternoon, and he didn't, not because he was stingy, but because he had come to understand something that many kind people in this world never understand. Respecting another human being, doesn't mean giving them what they lack. Respecting another human being means refusing to take away their right to earn it for themselves. For 3 years, Holly Quinn had been treated like a line of data, an application rejected by a machine, a name crossed off a work schedule, without anyone needing to give a reason. A number on a bill that could double in a single afternoon because of one polite question asked inside a conference room. And not one person anywhere along that chain had done anything illegal. That is the most chilling lesson this story leaves behind. The cruelest violence in modern life is rarely loud. It is silent, it carries a signature, and it always follows procedure. That is why the only thing capable of standing against it is the rule Matthew imposed upon himself. Every decision must have a name beneath it, because when a name must bear responsibility, a human being can no longer be reduced to a number. And perhaps the most beautiful detail of all is that a veterinary student who had left her education unfinished still couldn't abandon the habit of documenting everything, even when she believed no one would ever read it. The kindness you offer quietly today, without a name, without anyone knowing, without expecting gratitude, may return years later to save something far greater than you ever imagined. You simply don't know when. If this story touched something within you, please leave us a comment and tell us. Do you think Holly was right to refuse those $88,000? Or would you have made a different choice? And in your own life, have you ever been treated like a number instead of a human being? We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. Please subscribe to the channel, press the like button, and share this video with someone you believe needs to hear it, so that each day we can continue discovering more meaningful stories together. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.